This session, we are going to be concentrating on the principles of co-production, something that here at the ARC, we're very keen to incorporate in as many research projects as we can. So I'm delighted to introduce you to Dr. Nadia Brooks. She's our academic co-production theme lead here at the ARC, KSS, and she also works with the Centre for Health Service Studies based at the University of Kent. And with Nadia today is Dr. Vanessa Abrahamson, who's just started as a postdoctorate here with the co-production team. And they will be presenting this session this morning. So without any more ado, over to Nadia and Vanessa. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. As Pippa said, I am Nadia Brooks and I'm the Applied Research Collaborations co-production theme lead. I'm also a senior research fellow at the Centre for Health Service Studies at the University of Kent, which means that alongside that, I'm involved in a number of research projects, which are mainly funded by the National Institute for Health Research. Presenting with me is Vanessa Abrahamson. Vanessa, would you like to say anything more about yourself? Okay. So what are we going to cover in this morning's session? It's a little bit different from the title that was in the programme, just because we decided to split the two sessions. This one focusing more on co-production, the one this afternoon focusing more on public and community involvement and engagement. So we're going to briefly introduce the concept of co-production and some practical methods for approaching it. As you know, co-production can be applied in daily practice, in service improvement work, but the focus today is going to be in research. We'll be covering what is co-production, the key principles and features, some examples. Pippa is then going to come in and say something briefly about the link between co-production and public and community involvement and engagement, or PCIE, as we'll abbreviate it to. And then we'll sum up and give you a link to some further resources. As this is pretty much a whistle-stop tour, we advise that you follow up with our co-production guide, which is available on the ARC KSS website, and that signposts you to lots of other information. And although we're not having an opportunity for discussion today, the guide does contain some reflective exercises which you may want to take a look at. So if we begin with, where did co-production come from? Well, most people agree that co-production was first described in the 1970s by Elinor Ostrom, and she was an economist at Indiana University in the United States. She used the word co-production to explain why crime rates rose when the police changed from walking the beat to patrolling in cars. She believed that the relationships that police developed with people and the informal knowledge they exchanged with the community when they walked the beat was critical in preventing and solving crimes. She argued that the police needed communities as much as the communities needed the police, and used the term co-production to describe that relationship. The term was used again by by Edgar Kahn in reforming the youth justice system in Washington, D.C. in the United States. Kahn had an impact on crime rates and rates of reoffending because he involved both the young people and their families in the judicial process in a co-production kind of way. The term was used again by the King's Fund, an independent charity which works to improve health and care in England, and the Institute for Public Policy Research, which is a think tank, to make the point that healthcare for it to work, has to be a reciprocal relationship between doctors and patients. During the 1990s, there was less discussion about co-production because the idea of market driving improvement in public services was seen as more important. You may have heard of new public management and things like that, which meant people were referred to as consumers or customers. Health and social care was treated in the same way as goods and services that are bought and sold. But since the 2000s, people have become more interested in co-production again, and it's increasingly been put into practice across the public and voluntary sectors in the UK. The rise of co-production in social care particularly is strongly linked with the disability movement and the mental health user movement. So where does this fit with research? Well, since the late 1990s, a host of policies have emerged aimed at embedding public involvement within the NHS, and this impetus has been mirrored within health research within the UK. Researchers have increasingly been required through the national governance frameworks to involve members of the public through working with them rather than conducting research on them. This has been further encouraged through the integration of what was known as patient and public involvement by most of the main UK funders of health research. The Breaking Boundaries strategic review of public involvement across the National Institute for Health Research was commissioned by the Department of Health in March 2014. The review was the first full-scale inquiry into how far the NIHR had been successful in achieving its strategic goals around public involvement. And the end product was the report on the slide here, Going the Extra Mile, which amongst other things advocated the use of co-production as a way to foster partnership, reciprocity and openness with the public. Over time, the term's been increasingly used in health and social care about services, self-management and research. So defining co-production, what is it? There's many definitions of co-production, and you'll see more than one even in the guide that we produced, and all have a slightly different focus depending on what setting and application they're being used for. We do have an ARC definition of co-production where we've tried to encompass service delivery, self-management and research. But for the purposes of today, where we're specifically focusing on research, we'd adopt the involved definition. If you don't know what involve is, it used to be a body that promoted and supported patient and public involvement in NIHR funded research until it was merged with the NIHR Dissemination Centre last year. And their definition is, co-producing a research project is an approach where researchers, practitioners and the public work together, sharing power and responsibility from the start to the end of the project, including the generation of knowledge. We'll talk about the principles and key features shortly, but the key word here is sharing power. But this video summarizes what co-producing research or knowledge is in the form of an animation.
So, one way for a university to produce knowledge is like this. An expert finds a community, does their research, writes it up into a paper, and publishes it for everyone to see. This often gets results, but sometimes the people being researched can feel a bit left out. Either they don't ever get to see what the expert has found out, or they're left feeling the relationship was all take and no give. But there are other ways to go about it, and that's where co-production comes in. Co-production means universities and communities working together as partners to create knowledge. Both partners bring what they know and share it, and everyone learns in the process. Communities can help universities work out what research needs to be done and what questions need to be asked. And universities can help communities experiment with new experiences and skills. When we start co-producing, we don't know exactly what knowledge will emerge, but the process is open and shared amongst all the participants, and the way we work becomes part of the research. The university and the community are on the same journey. That's co-production.
I'm going to hand over to Vanessa now, who's going to talk to you about the principles, features, what you might need to think about when applying co-production.
Key principles. So the real nub is the power sharing. So if you don't have the power sharing, the rest doesn't really follow. And that's all to do with equal roles, valuing each other equally, understanding that everybody brings things to the table. We all have different experiences and understanding, whether that's as a service user, a carer, a clinician, a manager, a researcher. So in your kind of traditional NIHR type research, it's often, you still have that hierarchy. So you have your principal investigator, you have your research team, you might have your individual lay members, or you may have a group, a patient advisory group, but there is still that sense of hierarchy. So in co-production, you would get rid of that. You would see everyone is equal. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't have a PI, and it doesn't mean that somebody's got to be accountable overall, but that you share the responsibility and you share the decision making. So you want to access everybody's views, everybody's perspectives, everyone's knowledge and skills, to embrace diversity, and you'll access views that you wouldn't access otherwise. So for example, in a project that I was involved in end of life, by accessing the views of people who had been through the whole caring for somebody through the hospice process, it really influenced our data collection, our analysis. They were involved as co-ops, they were trained, they were respected members of our team. Everybody has an equal say, everybody is valued, and we learn from each other. So one of the interesting things that involves, say, is reciprocity also means that you put something in and you get something out. So it's not about draining your layouts for what you can get from them, but also thinking about what do they gain. So whether that's training, developing their skills, increasing their confidence, there's that sense of reciprocity. And I think that really feeds into that sense of building relationships. So if everybody feels like they're getting something out of it, and you trust each other, you respect each other, and you can see that you all bring different things to the table, that also feeds into your power sharing, and also then your ability to have valid output and to capture the impact of co-production. Can I have the next slide, Nadia? So those are the sort of nice grand principles. Involved then gives us some idea of how we might actually achieve them. So one of the key things is ongoing dialogue. So you always have to talk through, how is it going? Does everyone feel like they're being listened to, or has things started to drift and the researchers are doing their own thing and the lay members don't feel they're really significantly involved? So for example, with the hospice project, what came up at the end of the first year was that the lay co-applicants wanted to be involved in data analysis. So I then did some training with them around qualitative data analysis, and they then became very much part of the core team, and that fed right through to the end report. So it's that sense of a joint ownership in the project, whether it's research or service design, that people are involved in key decisions. So it doesn't mean everybody's involved in every decision, because that's not realistic, but everybody knows what's going on, everybody has a sense of ownership and a sense that they're being listened to, and the right people make the decisions, and everybody contributes to that where and when and as appropriate. So that also builds relationships and builds trust. And that you have to think about right from the start. So your first stakeholder meetings, ground rules, as traditional understanding of ground rules, but also thinking about how will we tackle hierarchy, how will we make sure everyone's listened to, people who may be more reticent to speak out, people who may have aphasia or early dementia and therefore find it difficult to speak out, how are you going to adapt things to their needs? So it's also around accessibility and making sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to contribute, which, you know, you might think you're doing it, but sometimes you then realise, actually, I haven't thought about, you know, whatever aspect. So you need to be flexible, and you need to expect the unexpected. So things can and do go wrong, things can go off on a tangent, and you might need to bring it back to your research question. While tangents are always good, particularly as PhD students, it's to be expected, you do need to make sure you answer your research questions by the end of your project. So there's a sort of balance of keeping everyone together as a team, and that's really helped by reflection. So what we did in one project was have a meeting every so often where we put time aside to reflect on the process. So separate to all our normal agenda items around data collection and governance and so forth, just having an informal time with sandwiches and cake to reflect on how things were going, how people felt. And that really helps with that team building and making sure that your co-production doesn't flag as people get tired through a 3-year project, because a 3-year project is a big ask. So you also want to evaluate the impact of co-producing your research. So you might do a log where everything your lay applicants or your public advisory group do or involved in, you log what happened, what the outcomes are and their perspective, so that you've got some kind of record of how was the process influenced, and then thinking about the outcomes. Next slide. So putting it into practice, the ARC West guides are very good. There's one on reflective practice, which asks some really nice questions to make you think through the practicality. So while we can't go through everything now, I'm just going to highlight a few sort of key things. So if you went to Rowena's talk yesterday about impact, she mentioned the importance of getting your stakeholders, or lay members in our case, on board right from the start. So you want to think about who's got influence and who's got a vested interest in your topic or your area. So you want to make sure that all the important people are represented right from the start. So that alludes to co-design, which of course the problem is that you may not have funding before you submit your bid. So I think that's come up in other talks as well. So you want to think about how and when you'll do it, what your time frame is, and you need to build in extra time. So developing trust and relationships takes longer than anticipated. And you've got to bear in mind that things don't go to plan, particularly for people who have long-term conditions and may be ill for a while. So you've got to think about what's feasible, and you've got to think about, does co-production match this project? Is it the best choice, or are there other forms of patient engagement that might be more appropriate? So, for example, a randomised controlled trial, there's not a lot of space for flexibility and altering your protocol and altering your method of data analysis. But that comes back to your preparation. So when you're thinking about what you're going to do, you need to build in those basic questions of, can I address the principles of co-production? Will it actually work in this project? And that also alludes again to the co-design. So in the next slide, we suggest that you need to think about, next slide, Nadia. We need to think about the flexibility aspect. Either are you flexible enough, or is the process flexible enough? You've got to build in that sense of, can you commit the time to building the relationships? So building relationships starts well before. So you might have, so for example, for a current bid I'm doing, I've had nearly a year lead-in where I've been sniffing out to find out who's most interested in it, who does it influence, who can I get on board, how can I get their ideas, particularly during the chaos of COVID, and start to build some kind of cohesive idea, plan and team. And then one needs to think about the benefits. So, I mean, I think there's not many cases where people don't feel they've benefited from the process. Just as if you're interested in learning, you're interested in research and service redesign, and you're interested in what happens at the end of it. So I think so long as you remember the principles of reciprocity and involving people and listening to them and valuing them, there will be benefits. So the next slide divides into a different way of looking at it, which thinks more about the co-design, co-delivery, co-evaluation and co-decision making. So it's just a different way of looking at it. So co-design is that early stage where you often don't have funding, but you're trying to build your team, you're trying to grow the seeds ready for when your funding is when you receive funding and you can then get on with it. Co-delivery is, of course, the implementation. And co-decision making, although Sky is alluding to allocation of resources, I think it's worth thinking of co-decision making as part of your process through the whole research, from thinking of your idea to looking at your impact. So it's really involving people to make sure that you're listening to everybody's skills, expertise, building it into your decision-making process and making sure that your hierarchy doesn't exist, that it is an equal process. And that means you do need to budget quite generously for your lay applicants' time, for any training they may want that you haven't thought about, for meetings to be expanded, rescheduled, for reimbursement of expenses as well as time. So you need to think a good 5 to 10% of your budget if you can. And then the co-evaluation, I think that's you can evaluate your outputs in terms of how were your lay members involved, how did it contribute to the process, how did it contribute to, for example, your report, or are they involved in making videos for the website or whatever. It's harder to demonstrate impact because impact is a longer term thing. So I think if you can co-evaluate the process, the analysis, the dissemination and the outputs, you're doing really well. And impact, think of that as a longer term, building relationships for your next project, thinking about diversifying according to what your lay applicants want or think is important. So I think it's back to you, Nadia.
Okay. Thanks, Vanessa. So now I'm going to take you through 2 project examples, one located in health and one located in social care. I'd also recommend the presentation from Caroline Nicholson and Richard Green, who talk about co-production in their project when it becomes available if you weren't able to make the session earlier on. I'm going to describe the aims of each project, who was involved, pick out where they tried to implement the principles and features of co-production, and what can be learned from this. So the first example is the ideal ward round, and if people do want more information about this particular project, we can put the link with the other information to do with the session. And that was to establish the views of patients, carers and professionals about the experience and ways of improving ward rounds in the context of acute adult inpatient mental health. And the idea was that they would come out with a set of recommendations that would help to improve ward round processes, outcomes and experiences. So this was led by people with lived experience of care and treatment, and was co-produced with carers, advocates, mental health professionals, and academic researchers. The idea came actually from people with the lived experience of care and treatment, but they acknowledged that the research needed guidance from professional researchers, but they didn't want to hand over that to them, which led to a co-produced approach to the project. So how did they try and enact some of the principles of co-production in that particular project? Well, they established 3 rules for everyone involved to help with that power sharing and inclusion of all perspectives. And those 3 rules from the beginning to the end of the project were that everyone's opinion held the same weight, that wherever they ended up in terms of methodology or outcomes, they would decide on that together. And whatever the project ultimately turned out to be, it had to make a real difference. And that had to be especially for the patients and the people with lived experience. They held regular project meetings where, as part of that, there was an open forum where ideas and developments at each stage of the project were discussed, and then decisions were made and voted on. Knowledge claims between project members were managed by a principle of parity of knowledge. So the people with clinical knowledge and the people with knowledge of mental distress by experience were treated in an equal way, so that there was no one group that dominated the discussions. Shared ownership of the project was prioritised, particularly the owning of the data collection and analysis stages of the project, as Vanessa kind of alluded to in her piece before. The academic researchers worked directly with the members with lived experience so that there was a sharing of knowledge and that skills were developed regarding data collection and analysis. And in return, the members with lived experience advised and supported how best to engage with the inpatient respondents and helped to achieve better interactions within those interviews. At the start of the project, a number of those with lived experience and carer members did express a lack of belief that this project could be truly co-produced. They believed at some point they would be sidelined or the project would be shelved by powers that were kind of beyond their control. And this view changed though as relationships developed over time. In terms of some of the features of co-production, it was key that they were all respectful of other members' opinions and experiences during the discussions. There was a commitment to minimising the use of technical terms and jargon, or where that couldn't be avoided, these were explained to people. There was a commitment to try to gain each member's views in pre-decision-making periods of discussion. And that continuous reflection, again, as Vanessa talked about, was very important for the process of the project as a whole, but also for keeping those relationships going within the project team. Decisions around the research were kept to face-to-face meetings because this was a pre-COVID project where information was presented, ideas were discussed, and then again, as I said, decisions were put to a vote. So the knowledge sharing that we talked about, particularly around research methodologies and practice, was shared. And it meant that people took ownership around this about sample sizes and which groups to survey. Everybody was also involved in delivering seminars and presentations in connection with the project, as this was seen as an opportunity for personal growth and development, and as a key way of valuing and evaluating the impact of co-producing the research. For the people with lived experience and carers, this was particularly important as they found presenting the findings of the research and acting as representatives of the project was a key way that they could take ownership of it. if you did listen to Caroline and Richard's presentation earlier, you'll know that one of the key challenges they found was around time and resources. And this again came up for this particular project. You know, the commitment of time and energy that needs to be involved in this is something that people will tend to underestimate. And probably the best way to address it is to try and think and be honest about the time and resource commitments that are needed. That the project scale, ambition, membership, approach to inclusion, flexibility, and reflection all need to be accommodated. But there are the positives that if it's genuinely co-produced, there'll be more motivation for people to actually stay involved with the project and commit and contribute time. The certainty required by funders around these same things, around timescales, outcomes, can be challenged by the principles and features and real life experience of co-production. But I think that's something that needs to be continually pushed and raised with them as an issue. So the key learning points from that particular project were, you know, that it's important to establish what co-production means in practical terms for you and the members of the project. As Vanessa said, you know, it may be that, you know, the ideal state is not necessarily achievable, but somewhere close to that can be. It's important to set out how the project will be accessible to people not from professional or academic backgrounds, and what support will be given to members to involve them as much as possible, just in case they have issues with that. Agreeing basic ground rules at the start of the project, this should always include the things about how people are going to be included, decision making, ownership and accountability, and how you'll work together. Regular meetings are also important throughout the project lifecycle, and putting major decisions to a group vote where possible. As Vanessa said, it may not be possible to involve people in every decision, but where that's possible, it should be supported and encouraged. And the key thing is, at the end of a project, to acknowledge everyone's contribution and make sure that credit is shared between everybody. This particular project surveyed 100 current and previous inpatients and their carers. And through a series of focus groups, 12 recommendations for ward rounds were made and then piloted and evaluated. So I'm now going to move on to the second example, which was located within social care. And this is one project that I was actually involved with, funded by the NIHR School for Social Care Research. You can just about see me with different coloured hair sitting around the table in that photograph. And this was a project that aimed to identify which needs, if any, were being met by shared lives or adult placement for people with a learning disability. And this is a type of community support where in most cases a person requiring support goes and lives with a paid carer and their family. The project involved people with lived experience of being supported by the service, paid carers, other staff and academic researchers. Co-production starts with people and places rather than a research question, but unlike the previous project I just talked about, where the idea had come from the people who'd used inpatient services, this isn't what happened here. And this is what I mean about you can't always achieve, you know, co-production in its purest sense. The idea for the research didn't come from the users of the service. They were involved after that point. I think we need to acknowledge in the real world that an idea has often come from funding directives or from a recognised need. But we tried to enact the principles and features as much as possible. We recruited people with lived experience and staff to become part of our research team where they worked alongside us. So one of the things that we found extremely important was making time in meetings for getting to know one another. And that might seem like, you know, an obvious thing to state, but I think Vanessa mentioned sandwiches and cake, and we found that talking over lunch as part of those meetings was extremely important. Not rushing from one meeting to another. You need to make space and time to actually talk to people about themselves personally and professionally. Learning how to work together is also key in terms of co-production principles. And one of the ways that we tried to do this at the suggestion of one of the organisations was that the whole team before the first meeting produced one-page profiles about themselves, which were circulated to everyone before the first meeting so that we could get to know one another better. So these included a photo so that people knew who we were. We also wore stickers with our names on so that people got to know who each other were quicker. And these one-page profiles had sections for things like what people like and admire about me, what's important to me, and how to support me well at work. And the entire team produced those, and they were circulated around each other. For our particular group, payment was important, as it meant everyone in the room was on a more equal footing because of that. And we were recognising the expertise that everyone brought to the process. It was very important for some of the members with a lived experience to be on an equal par, to feel like they're doing the same job as we were. So the whole team was involved in trying to create this shared ownership, and this was prioritised particularly through the data collection analysis stages of the project, which is similar to the previous project we talked about. The whole research team was involved with this. The members with the lived experience, for example, identified research questions that we hadn't actually thought of around relationships and people being able to stay with the people who were being supported and how important that was. And they also conducted interviews for us, either alongside academic researchers or independently or supported by their paid carers. In terms of the features of co-production, we gathered feedback during meetings from everyone involved at each stage of the process. And we were very aware that we needed the flexibility to make changes as time went on. We all gained personally and professionally from the process. We all gained knowledge, enhanced skills, and came up with new opportunities for learning through working alongside each other. And we worked, for example, in terms of personal and professional development as well, we were invited to present at a conference, and the members of the team with lived experience were keen to do this themselves. So obviously, academic conferences are in a certain format. For example, you have to submit an abstract. So we worked together to produce an abstract for the conference, but they decided that instead of traditional sort of PowerPoint presentation, they were going to have a series of photographs on the screen which documented the project and their experience within that. And then in turn, they described what they'd done as part of the research team and what it meant to them personally. And to me, this illustrates the shared ownership of the project, because obviously we were at first a bit like, we need to do a proper abstract for a conference and we need to have bullet points on the slides, but actually that isn't what happened, and it worked very well once we'd managed to get over and relinquish our tendency to control things to them. So similarly to the first example, and Caroline and Richard's example, and the things that Vanessa talked about, the commitment of time and energy required was something that we all underestimated. In fact, so we could hold a final meeting with everybody, we had to request additional resources from the funder. And we were very lucky that they were willing to accommodate that, so that we could have a bit of a celebration and tie everything up, talk about dissemination avenues and where we went from there. So the key learning that we took from this is that, you know, in an ideal world, unfortunately, we couldn't involve people at the very, very early stages of developing the research project. The broad research questions, the method had already been identified at the behest of the funder. This wasn't ideal, and so for the next project that we tried to take forward, we worked with that group to generate some research ideas around things that were important to them. And we also included them as co-applicants on the grant application. I think that, you know, flexibility, as everybody has mentioned, is a key factor, and that taking time to get to know each other is important, because you need to have that trust to be able to co-produce effectively. So the project involved interviews with people being supported by adult placement and their paid carers. We identified that adult placement is meeting the needs of people with a learning disability in a lot of areas. That's what our co-researchers uncovered through their interviews. You know, the headline messages were that are from this project is that, you know, you need to involve people early, need to get to know people, you need to make sure you have enough time and resources, and keep an eye on that power sharing. You know, there was plenty of uncomfortable times during the project where, you know, researchers have a particular view of how an interview interaction should take place. But the co-researchers kind of turned that on its head. And we had to keep in mind that the reasons why we were involving them in doing that. So I'm now going to hand over to Pippa, who's going to talk a little bit about public and community involvement and engagement, which is often the structure that co-production builds on. And as I'm sure you'll see from her presentation later on today, some of the, you know, the key features, for example, mirror those of public and community involvement and engagement. So thanks, Pippa.
Thank you very much. Yes, I just wanted to clarify that, you know, the public community involvement and engagement team, we're going to call it the PCIE because that's easier, team here at the ARC, and we're very much the operational angle of involving people in research. We work closely with Nadia and Vanessa, who aim for the higher echelons of co-production, and that's where we like to think that people would aim their projects, but we are under no illusion that it's really difficult. We've heard some fantastic examples today of projects that have attempted to use co-production with varying degrees of success, but it's never easy. And as you work through your research projects, there's all sorts of reasons why you may not be able to head for co-production, you know, through funding, through time, through coming to the process, you know, late in the day when a lot of it already been decided and you haven't got the ability to be flexible. That's absolutely fine. We're very practical and understand that it's not always achievable. But what we would say is please do consider people in your research and do think about other forms of involving the public in your projects to really bring a different perspective. And this is something we'll be talking about in greater depth this afternoon, about how you do what is public involvement, how do you do it, who do you use, and why would you want to do it anyway. But here, just thinking about how public involvement feeds into co-production, I really like the Einstein ladder of participation, because it really makes you think about how far up this ladder are you managing to get with your projects. And I really would challenge you just to look at some of those boxes on the right hand side and be honest with yourselves. You don't have to tell anybody else, but be honest with yourself about where does your project sit in this ladder. And, if it's not as high as you might want it to be, then maybe just try thinking about pushing it up a level or two by being a little bit more flexible, being a little bit more open in considering other people's views, thinking about how you can involve members of the public in your team. And we'll be talking this afternoon about some of the roles that public members can play in your research cycle, from the beginning of trying to generate ideas and questions, which Nadia and Vanessa have spoken about. But even if it's later on down the line, they can help you with things like inputting into your PCI plan, your budget, your ethics proposals, looking at making sure your methodology you're describing is appropriate to the sorts of cultures and people that you're going to be aiming your research at. They can help you with the language you're using to make sure that you're more accessible for people. They can help you connect to communities and be that connector with what you're doing from an academic point of view to getting the views of the communities that they represent. They can help you disseminate the information at the end, getting that message back out to people. So there's lots of roles that members of the public can help you with. And here at the PCIE team, we have members who are signed up with the Applied Research Collaboration here. We have a payroll system that we can pay them on. We can help you to plan your PCI plans and budgets. So do please, come and talk to us if there's anything we can help you with, because we would love to support you in your co-production journeys. But even if you can't do the full co-production, then please just think about how you can involve the public in that project cycle, and we're here to help you with that. So yes, it's just a matter of degree. How many steps up that ladder can you make it? Thank you.
Thanks, Pippa. So just to sort of tie things up really, as Pippa mentioned, the next session focuses on PCIE with a small slot on co-production featured there. Please do take a look at some of the resources that are available on the ARC KSS website. What we hope to do is build on this research week session to produce, I'm not going to call it a course, but some more sessions that have been, but this time what we hope to do is co-design those with public professionals and students. So if anybody who's on this session would like to get involved in that, then please indicate in the chat. One of the things that we want to do is cover in more detail and consider around things like when to take stock and gather evidence of co-production, whether there's progress towards personal outcomes, measure understanding, about taking photos, creating blogs and websites, writing up meeting notes, all those things that you can use to document that process. That's one of the things that we'd like to explore in the future. And then it just is left for me to say thank you. And our contact details are there if you want to follow up anything.